In this section, we're going to talk about views and how they're used within a Backbone.js application. Views are simply rectangular areas that exist on your screen for your application. It can be the entire body of your application, or it could be a fragment within a view on your application. So it could be a list, it could be a form. Those can be views as well. In fact, those are thought of as subviews of your main containing application, of your main view. Now, the views in Backbone typically observe what is happening with your models and collections, and are notified when your model or your collections change, and this allows the view to update itself. In most design pattern books, they talk about views as being dumb and that their knowledge of models and controllers is very limited. And essentially what your view's purpose is to sit and act as a place where your users can interact with your applications. And that usually involves either reading or editing the model data. But in a traditional MVC, the actual updating of the model happens in the controller. So views tend to be more the visual representation. So let's go ahead and define our first view inside of Backbone, and we're looking at view-01.html, and all we're going to do is create a view called home view, and inside this view we aren't going to actually have anything inside of it. But let's go ahead and see what we get when we go into view 1 here. So as expected, we get a blank white screen. But let's go ahead and let's actually create a new instance of our home view, kind of like what we did with our models and our collections where we create an instance. So I'm going to call this wine app, and I'm going to make that equal to a new home view and hit enter. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's output what wine app is. And if we output it, we get this variable back, and we look inside this object, and we see that we have a $EL, and we have a CID, which is your internal client ID, and we also have another EL here, but without the $, which is an HTML div, and then we also have some options. So let's go ahead and let's actually output our wine app EL. That's our element. And you see what it does is it gives us back an empty div. So this is a really key concept that you're going to need to understand when you're working with views in Backbone, is that every view has an attribute called EL, and that stands for element, and this is where you're going to be putting anything that's rendered in your view, whether that's a button, whether that's a list, whether it's just some text. Whatever you're going to render goes inside of this EL. And without even declaring the element, Backbone will actually, if one isn't declared, it'll create one for you, and it will always be an empty div. And then inside of that div is where you're going to place all of your view elements, your what makes up your view. And so I like to think of it as sort of like it gives you an empty box, and you're going to fill that box with lots of different elements like buttons and lists and things like that. So I haven't declared it, as you saw in that code, but Backbone creates this element for me. Now, why do we have a $sign element? Well, this is the jQuery representation of your element, and what this allows you to do is it allows you to call different jQuery methods like append. Let's say you want to append something to your element, so you can do that with the other EL. So that takes care of our first code example. So let's go and take a look at our second code example. And here we're actually going to render. And when you render, what you're doing is you are basically saying, go ahead and actually fill that box, fill that element with some stuff. And as you can see here, I'm taking my element, my $sign element, and I'm using the jQuery append method, and I'm just adding some HTML. I'm just passing in a string. You can pass in other things, but in this case, I'm just passing in a string. And I'm also returning this. So I'm basically saying when you use return this, what you're allowing Backbone to do is it allows you to actually chain your methods together. So it's returning itself, and then you can actually append additional calls onto it, similar to the chaining that you can do inside of jQuery. So I'll go back here, and I'll go into view number 2. And again, we don't have anything in our view, so let's go ahead and create our wine app again. I'll say wine app is equal to new home view. Okay, and now I have my wine app element, and I'm going to use my up arrows here to go ahead and grab that element. So there we go. We've got our empty div. So now let's go ahead and let's do wine app, and let's actually call the render method ourselves and see what happens. So I call render, we get back our wine app object. But now let's see what happens when we look at the wine app.el value. So we do that, and we see there's some dots in there, and we can expand that, and we can actually see that the render method was called, and we went ahead and we appended the h1 tags into our empty div. We were filling the box, as I was calling it. And let's go ahead and let's call render again and see what happens. So I call render, and let's call it a second or a third time, and let's go ahead and look inside of our element now and see what happens. So now you can see I've rendered multiple times, and I'm seeing multiple versions of my h1 header tag has been rendered into my div. So this is something you'll want to watch, because when you're first starting out with Backbone, you might end up having the render method called more than once, and if you aren't coding for that, you may end up with multiple copies of your data inside of your view, and you want to watch out for that and code in a way that keeps that from happening. Of course, unless you want that to happen. So yeah, so here we go. This is the render method we just called. We are going to grab the $sign element, and we're doing the append there, and we're returning this. So now we're going to introduce the initialize method. Every view has an initialize method that you can create, and inside of that you can add any variables or methods that you want to call when the view is first created. Initialize is only called once, and it's called when you create your view for the first time. So let's go back to our browser. I'll go into view 3, and let's go ahead and let's create our home view again. So I'll create a new home view. And now I'm going to go ahead and look at the element inside of there. And as you can see, we've got our element already rendered for us inside of our EL, our element attribute. It's already been filled with some HTML because we had the render happen on initialize. Now if we go back, we'll go to the next example, example 4. And so now in this situation, I'm going to wait until my document is ready. I'm using document.ready from our just straight up jQuery. And inside of that, I'm going to create my new instance of my wine app. So I'll go back here. I'll click on view 4. And if I do wineapp.el, and we can see it's already been created for me, and it's already been put onto the screen. So now we want to go ahead and let's do a shortcut here. Let's go ahead and let's add this to our page. So the way we can do that is we can actually say select the body, and we can do an append, and then we can say wineapp.el, and now we're selecting the body and we're appending our element, and there it is. It's been appended. And if I try to append it again, you'll notice it doesn't let me append it more than once. That's because this div is unique. There's only one of these elements, and I'm only going to be appending it once to my body, and it doesn't matter if I try to append it multiple times, it won't allow me to do that. Very different than what we saw with render, where we were actually rendering the same content multiple times into the same view. The view is only able to be appended onto the body once here. Now let's go to view 05 example here. And now let's dive a little bit more into this concept of the EL element. So EL, when we left it undefined, it was a div. But in this code example, I actually want to say that my EL is equal to my body. And now that actually introduces a whole new thing. So when I render, it's actually going to render to the body tag and not render to a div that's automatically that's being appended to the body. So here I make my home view is going to be equal to the body element, and you'll also notice that I'm adding, I'm selecting and I'm emptying my body element before I append to it. And this means that anytime I re-render my home view, that I won't end up with multiple copies of my view added to the body. I want to empty it first. So I'll go back and I'll click on view 5, and there for the first time we actually see our view rendered for us automatically without having to type any commands into the console, which is really nice. Now I was talking about subviews, and in code 06 I introduce a second view. This is a list view. And inside of the list view, I'm going to actually give it a tag name. So I'm going to say, instead of making this a div, I want to make this an unordered list. And I'm not going to initialize it, because I just want to sort of leave it blank there for now. And when it renders, it's going to, first it's going to empty the unordered list, and then it's going to append 2 items to my unordered list. So let's go back and click on view 6, and we'll see there's our header. Our H1 has been rendered, but we don't have our list view hasn't been rendered yet. So I'm going to go ahead and say list view equals new list view, and I'm going to actually create that list view. And now I'm going to take a look at my list view element and see what that looks like. So my list view element right now is just an empty unordered list, and that's because I didn't call render when it was initialized, because I wanted to manually render it. So let's go ahead and manually render that. List view dot render, and we'll say list view element, and now we can expand our element, and we see we've got our list added there as well. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to append this to my body. Okay, and now it's been appended to my body. Now the interesting thing is what's going to happen if I do list view dot render. If I called render, it doesn't do anything here. But if I look at my list view element, you can see it's just doing the 2 list elements here. And that's because I'm emptying the unordered list before I actually append it. I'm actually going to go into list view 6 here, and I'm actually going to remove that empty statement. Sorry, the empty statement inside of our list view here. I'll save that. And let's go back here. Let's do a refresh. I'll create my list view. I'll render it. And now I'm going to append it. And now if I render it again, you see it just depends on there. I'm not reloading the whole home view. I'm just refreshing that one fragment, that one list view element that's inside of my body tag right now. And that's the only part that's being rendered and updated right now. So I can keep rendering it, and it keeps adding new versions of the two list elements that I have in my render method. Now let's go to our final example, and this is where we combine everything. In view 07, what we've done is we've asked our home view to create a new list view inside of the render method and append that to the body element for us. And you'll notice inside of the append method we have this .list view, .render, .element. So that's where that chaining comes in place. That's where we're returning this, and that's how we're able to then grab the element from the list view after we call the render method all in one single line of code. Let's go over to our browser, and we'll go into view 7, and there we can see that the home view is being added to the body and rendered, as well as a sub view is being rendered as well inside of our home view. So that covers views, and in our next section we'll take a look at how you can combine templates with your views.